For nearly 2 years, we as a country have watched a humanitarian crisis unfolding at our southern border. I'm guessing that everyone in here can picture it: a child, a parent, an entire family forcibly separated and detained in the name of border control. These are images that are seared into our memories. For many of us, they fuel our outrage and hopefully also drive our activism. Beyond the border, there are millions of other Latinx children facing oppression. Theirs is a quieter form of oppression, though. And so in our national psyche, these children often remain faceless and silent. But if we look, we'll see that the crisis that starts at the border extends far beyond it into almost every community in the United States. In my research, I found that for the most part, Latinx children in the US are being grossly disserviced by our health and education systems. In a longitudinal study out of New York City, my research team found that 82% of the 750 children in our sample were below grade level in math or reading in 3rd grade, and 61% were below grade level in both. That's shocking that 4 out of 5 of our kids are failing in school by the time they're 8 and 9 years old. And what's more shocking is that our study findings are perfectly in line with national statistics. At the population level, most of our Latinx students in public schools are struggling, and the implications are pretty serious. A Latinx child who's not reading at grade level by 3rd grade is up to 8 times less likely to finish high school than a white child. We all know that poverty is a primary cause for statistics like these. Latinx children, actually more than any other group in this country, are segregated, not only by race, ethnicity, and poverty, but also by language. But it's also more than poverty. Even Latinx children from middle-income homes are up to 2 times more likely to drop out of school than white children. And so our team looked for other causes. We looked for causes in the home and even in the children themselves. And in the home, we found that even with limited resources, moms were warm and nurturing. They were reading and providing learning opportunities to their kids. They were making sure they got good sleep. The kids themselves started school with lots of strengths and skills. They followed instructions, they got along with others, they were good listeners, they were flexible and adaptable in the face of change. We also found, like many others have, that some, about 1 in 3, of our Latinx kids were below average in early academic skills. Research shows that school readiness, or those foundational skills that kids need to be successful in the classroom, are critical because kids who start out below average are at risk for falling further and further behind as they move through school. But what about the 66% of kids who started school ready to learn? Why were they ready to learn when they started school and failing just a few years later? A recent national survey found that most, about 80%, of Latinx adults report that there's discrimination against the Latinx population in the US. And this discrimination happens in our everyday spaces. It happens at our work, it happens in our neighborhoods, it happens at school, and in our health clinics. And the chance of experiencing discrimination is actually higher for US-born Latinx folks compared with immigrants. 60% say that they're discriminated against by the police. About half say that they're subjected to slurs and insults. About a quarter say that people act afraid of them simply because they're Latinx. Consider this example. These 2 US citizen women, Marta Hernandez and Ana Suda, were arrested while they were buying eggs in a convenience store in Montana. And when they asked the Customs and Border Protection agent why they were being arrested, they were told it was because they were speaking Spanish. The women were released pretty quickly, within about an hour or so, but Francisco Galicia, a US citizen high school student, was detained for 23 days in a Texas detention center by CBP. He was stopped on his way to a college soccer game and his citizenship status was questioned. And he told CNN that he almost signed to be deported just to escape the mistreatment of the facility. Gerardo Gonzalez Jr. was detained for even longer, for months, after immigration officials mistakenly wrote in his files that he was born in Mexico. Mr. Gonzalez was born in Los Angeles. These are cases that all make it pretty clear that neither documentation status nor living beyond the border protects Latinx folks from being targeted. CBP is authorized by law to detain anyone they suspect of an immigration violation. And the court has ruled that even a person's haircut is fair game in determining that suspicion. In our research, we found that because of the anti-immigrant climate, Latinx parents are limiting the time they spend outside of their homes. They are avoiding medical care and social services. And they're doing so even if they're US citizens. These avoidance behaviors are protective, but they also have real health consequences. One study found a 24% increase in low birth weight to babies born to Latinx moms, whether they were US born or immigrant, after immigration officials raided the town's factory. On a psychological level, this anti-immigrant climate creates a narrative about the entire Latinx population as criminal, as freeloading, as aliens. And these are ideas and views that are adopted by the public, so that ultimately, anyone who looks or sounds Latinx is seen as dangerous, as invasive. And in our racially stratified society, those perceptions of inferiority are strongest for Latinx folks with dark skin. Race is something that we've generally ignored in our research on Latinx populations. Race, of course, is not ignored in real life. Our skin color and other aspects of our appearance trigger racial stereotypes and affect the ways that people see us and interact with us, starting when we're 2 and 3 years old, if not younger. In that national survey, Latinx folks with dark skin reported the most discrimination, including being treated as intellectually inferior. So it's not entirely surprising that the 65% of Latinx children in our study with brown and black skin were at higher risk for academic underachievement compared with light-skinned kids. In fact, Afro-Latinx kids were doing worse in school starting in first grade and into third grade, even though they had started school with a higher level of academic skills. We also found that skin color was associated with mental health. Parents and teachers both gave the highest ratings of hyperactivity, of aggression, of anxiety, and of depression to the kids with the darkest skin color. Mental health problems were common for our entire sample, though, and actually, according to moms, 15% of our kids had clinically significant depressive symptoms, and an astonishing 40% had anxiety symptoms. And this was when kids were 6 and 7 years old. The kids themselves said the same thing. They were anxious and they were depressed. And we know that anxiety and depressive symptoms interfere with learning. And when they persist, like they did for the kids in our study, they have toxic effects as they get under the skin. Parents help kids adapt to these kinds of adverse conditions. And in our study, we found that Latinx parents were helping kids by helping them feel proud of their cultural heritage, of their background, of their history and traditions and customs. They were building up their ethnic identity. But they weren't talking about race. And in our society, Latinx children need to learn about race. Racial socialization practices have long been part of the repertoire of African American parents who build up their kids' racial identity as a way of combating all the dehumanizing messages that Black children hear outside of their homes. For Latinx children, ethnic identity and racial identity appear to be part of the armor that they need to grow up in the United States. When I picture young Latinx kids suiting up in armor to face these battles outside of their homes, it makes sense with all of these findings that are coming out of our research. These are kids who are entering their classrooms with so many strengths and skills, with some gaps in early learning, but with warm relationships with moms who nurture them and help them feel proud of who they are. That is a foundation that should be more than enough to propel a child to success. And instead, over time, their learning and their mental health is undermined, so that by the time they're 8 and 9 years old, too many of our kids are failing in school and are anxious and depressed. It's irresponsible for any of us to think that these kinds of findings are not inextricably linked with race and immigration-based discrimination. This is a discrimination that maybe starts at the border, but that very clearly permeates beyond it. It's time to broaden the narrative about the damage that we're causing to include all of our Latinx children, to see their faces and hear their voices and recognize their lived experiences, and most importantly, to root ourselves firmly as allies to preserve their humanity and their brilliance. Thank you.